Guys, I have a confession to make. Remember in the GeoTracks video when I said my biggest train obsession as a kid was Thomas? Well, if you know me on Discord, you already know this, but it never stopped being an obsession. I am a Thomas fan and proud of it. This show defined my childhood, and it has an incredibly interesting history that I can't wait to share with you all. Making a Thomas video is something I've dreamt of doing for years, and when I say years, I mean it. This has been on my mind since my early days of content creation. But I'm not just making one video, I'm making two. This first one will cover the model series, made up of the classic era seasons 1 through 7, and the hit era seasons 8 through 12. The eventual part 2 will cover the CGI series, which is the nitrogen era seasons 13 through 16, the Brenner era seasons 17 through 21, and the Big World Big Adventures era seasons 22 through 24. I will also only be reviewing the show itself in these videos, not the movies. I might do another couple videos talking about the movies if people want it though. I think that could be pretty fun. Now, without further ado, let's dive in to Thomas and Friends. Before we can get into reviewing the series, we need to discuss how it came to be in the first place. Let's go back to 1942. Reverend Wilbert Awdry was an English countryman with a fascination with all things railroading, and when his 2-year-old son Christopher was sick in bed, Wilbert entertained him with stories about talking steam engines. Edward, an older, smaller engine out to prove he's still useful. Henry, a bigger, grumpy engine who learned sense when his selfishness lands him with being bricked up in a tunnel. And Gordon, a total hotshot and the biggest engine on the railway, who gets humbled when he breaks down and Edward and Henry need to rescue his train. That's right folks, this franchise got its start as bedtime stories for a sick child. So heartwarming. In 1945, Wilbert was convinced to publish his stories, and they were a home run success. Wilbert would go on to write 26 books total, dubbed the Railway series, and then Christopher took the reins and brought the series to 42 books. Now, you might be wondering, where's Thomas? Thomas wasn't introduced until the second book, but as time went on, he quickly became the series' most popular character. In the early 1980s, Britt Allcroft approached Wilbert and floated the idea of a TV adaptation of his books. He was hesitant at first, as this wasn't the first time someone had tried this. There had been a couple attempts in the past, but neither of them got anywhere. However, he was eventually convinced, and in 1984, the world of television was introduced to Thomas the Tank Engine. The classic era was hands down the best era of the show, no question about it. The entire team did an amazing job bringing these stories to life, from the vibrant and detailed sets, to moving eyes on the character props to give them an extra layer of life, to the catchy and varied musical score by Mike O'Donnell and Junior Campbell, to the narration by the ex-Beatle himself, Ringo Starr. The characters themselves are also great, and all of them have their own little arcs. Thomas is a cocky shithead and matures over time, culminating in him being rewarded with his own branch line. Edward is getting old and proves he's still a useful asset to the railway. Henry has an entire multi-episode journey about him being locked up in the tunnel and then his struggles with being ill, leading to him having a violent crash and being rebuilt into one of the railway's most capable engines. Gordon is a pompous hotshot and gets humbled when his arrogance gets him into trouble. James thinks very highly of himself and, like Thomas and Gordon, gets humbled and has to prove himself again. Percy is a cheeky little trickster and deals with his carelessness causing trouble. And Toby has to face the closure of his old railway but is given a new lease on life when Sir Topham Hatt buys him to help Thomas out. Season 1 was a spectacular start to the series, and it would only get better from there. Season 2 was a big step up. Several iconic things started to make an appearance here. Characters like Duck, Donald and Douglas, Diesel, Bill and Ben, Boko, and Daisy were all introduced in this season. Story beats like the concept of an engine being scrapped or big violent crashes were also introduced and would become recurring points as the series went on. The set design this season is worthy of praise too. The sets were a lot bigger and more detailed, designed with multiple camera angles in mind so they could play around with lots of tracking and panning shots. And as the adaptations dug further into the books, the stories and sets began to work in real-life elements as well. The island of Sodor felt like a real place someone could go and visit. Season 3 marked a bit of a shift in the series. This season was not entirely Railway series stories, instead being half adaptations and half original episodes. And I'd say most of the original ones hold a candle to Awdry's work pretty well. They took the characters as Wilbert wrote them and expanded on them, adding new details that really helped to flesh them out. Some of these original episodes were actually adapted from magazine stories written by Andrew Brenner. Remember him for the CGI video, I cannot stress this enough. The set design became more vibrant and colorful, and they loved using all new working water sets. This was also when the music transitioned from being very synthy to being more grandiose and orchestral. This season had a few new characters, but the standout one is definitely Oliver. His debut episode, Escape, is one of the series' greats, introduced in a very sorry state, running away to the safe haven of Sodor to avoid being scrapped. I love it when the show gets dark. It's at this point I also want to mention the narrators for this season and how the show was distributed overseas. Thomas is a British show, and when the show came to America, it did so in the form of a show called Shining Time Station. It was about human characters and a miniature man named Mr. Conductor. The characters would have a problem, and Mr. Conductor would tell them a related story, transitioning into Thomas episodes. For the first 2 seasons, Mr. C was played by Ringo Starr, so he had narrated the UK and US dubs for those seasons. Starting in season 3, however, Ringo stepped down. The UK narrator became Michael Angelis, who would remain the UK narrator all the way through season 16, and the new US narrator, aka Mr. Conductor, was stand-up comedian George Carlin. Yeah, that George Carlin. And they had him go back and redub the first 2 seasons for home media. The George Carlin dubs were the ones I primarily had on DVD as a kid, and Carlin will forever be my favorite Thomas narrator. May he rest in peace. Season 4 marked the introduction of the narrow gauge engines and Skarloey Railway. Their episodes take up half the season, and I love every single one. By the end of their story, you know exactly what each engine is all about, and the mountain and forest sets that come with them look amazing. Something interesting to note here is that filming with the narrow gauge engines was notoriously difficult. It was hard to get good camera angles because they were so small, they couldn't make smoke on their own and always had to have their battery packs hidden off screen or in a truck behind the engine, and their running gear jammed constantly. They had such a hard time with these guys that the crew built all new, bigger ones for the very next season. Unfortunately, this would be the last season to adapt Railway series stories for quite some time. Wilbert Awdry passed away in 1997, so they began writing only original stories from then on. Season 4 also marked the end of Shining Time Station. Season 5 onward would air in America as standalone episodes like they did everywhere else in the world. Speaking of which, Season 5 is the best season of the show, no ifs, ands, or buts, and if you disagree, fight me. I could go on for hours about this season alone. This was the show's biggest season ever, because it was more than just another season. They had to give it their all here because there was a potential movie deal on the line. Brett Allcroft wanted to produce a Thomas the Tank Engine movie for the big screen, but the team first had to prove they could make something on a cinematic scale, and they absolutely delivered. I'm a sucker for all the crazy action scenes in this show, and Season 5 has no shortage of them. Busy Going Backwards, Toby and the Flood, and Put Upon Percy are some of my personal favorites in this regard. But it's not just action episodes. This season also has some laid-back, happy stories like Make Someone Happy, funny ones like By George or Lady Hat's Birthday Party, and possibly the best scary episode in the series, Duncan Gets Spooked. As for the voice talent, George Carlin left the show when Shining Time Station ended, so the new US narrator became Alec Baldwin. Despite what people may think of him now, his narration here is still very enjoyable. The characters this season are noteworthy too, because it seems like everyone is really snippy and irritable. I like to call this season the one where everyone is an asshole to each other, and I am all here for it. The banter that comes from these interactions is so fun to watch. I can easily call Season 5 the peak of the Thomas franchise. It never got better than this. I really don't think there are any episodes in these first 5 seasons that are truly bad. Even the worst ones are just okay. But change was on the horizon. Little did anyone know, the show was about to begin a downward spiral. Remember how I mentioned a movie earlier? That movie was Thomas and the Magic Railroad. And I won't be doing an in-depth review of it here, but it is important to mention. Because this thing was a box office failure, and it completely screwed over the general public's perception of Thomas, now seeing it as a mindless show for babies. Season 6 came out a couple years after Magic Railroad, and thankfully nothing from the movie was ever mentioned in the show again, but there was a very noticeable step down in quality production-wise. I don't know what kind of cameras they filmed this season on, but everything looked so desaturated and unappealing. The engine props were all painted with some kind of matte finish, which only made them look even more like toys than before, rather than real locomotives. And when episodes in this season were bad, they were bad. Percy and the Haunted Mine, Middle Engine, and Rusty Saves the Day are usually what people point to when it comes to this season dropping the ball. But it wasn't a bad season overall. In fact, I think it was pretty good. Twin Trouble, World's Strongest Engine, and Gordon Takes a Tumble are some of my all-time favorites, including my actual all-time favorite and the first episode I ever saw as a kid, Thomas and the Jet Engine. So overall, Season 6 was still a very good season, but it was definitely the weakest one so far. Season 7 is considered to be the black sheep of the classic era due to its complicated production history, but we'll get to that in a minute. Visually, this season is a huge step up from season 6. Everything is so much more bright and colorful, it's very refreshing. The stories, however, are a bit lacking in my opinion. Don't get me wrong, there are plenty of really good episodes here, but none of them are really on par with the early seasons to me. And it continues the trend of the bad episodes being genuinely bad, but this time those episodes are made even worse by character derailment, pun partially intended. I think the biggest examples of this are Trusty Rusty, when Duncan suddenly regains his hatred of Rusty even though that was resolved back in season 4, or the Old Bridge, when Skarloey goes from being a wise old sage to a childish nervous wreck, which would unfortunately become a trend in later seasons. This season is also remembered for introducing a bunch of new characters who had potential to be great additions to the show, but barely appeared again. Characters like Arthur, Murdoch, or Fergus, although Fergus not appearing again kinda makes sense. The only ones who stuck around were Spencer, who became a pretty prominent and popular side character, and Emily, who would go on to become a new main character. Now let's get into season 7's production, because man, this thing went through production hell. Around the time they were producing season 7, Thomas was bought out by Hit Entertainment. Hit had a new vision for Thomas, which we'll get to shortly, but long story short, the rebrand took priority and season 7 had to be rushed out. Due to the time and budget restrictions, this season totally suffers from the overuse of stock footage. And they're using footage from past seasons that were filmed in a much lower definition, so switching between that and the newer footage is incredibly jarring. Something else to note is that up until this point, there had usually been a few years between each season's release, but season 7 being rushed out was the start of a new standard for the show, a new season every single year. Despite that though, they got the season out and it aired in the UK as normal. In the US, however, the season was heavily modified thanks to Hit's rebrand. The American versions of these episodes came with the new theme song, all new music composed by Robert Hartshorn, replacing the original Mike and Jr. score, and yet another new narrator. Starting in season 7, Alec Baldwin was replaced by Michael Brandon, who would remain the American narrator through season 16 alongside Michael Angelis in the UK. Maybe it's because I mainly watch the US dub that I don't look back on this season too fondly, because the guy can only tolerate Michael Brandon for so long. But despite its rocky production, I would still call season 7 a good season. I think I prefer season 6, making 7 the worst of the classic series for me, but I still like it, and it was a pretty good send-off to classic Thomas. The classic era of Thomas and Friends is a product of a bygone time. A time when kids shows had effort and passion put into them. A time when they didn't talk down to the kids or blatantly state the morals and treated their young audience with a level of intelligence. A time when they could be enjoyed by anyone. That's not to say there are no shows like that today, but Thomas was special. Seeing working models based on real trains running on realistic sets and the exceptionally clever writing and characters, that's what made it stand out. And these first few stellar seasons are why so many people all over the world, myself included, continue to invest time in this show, and why we love that little blue tank engine and the island he lives on. The island of Sodor, the magical land where dreams come true. Now let's see how everything went to shit. Put simply, Hit Entertainment broke the show. Their new vision for Thomas involved catering to a much younger age demographic, and the show went from being for all ages to being for toddlers. The runtime of the episodes was increased from 4.5 minutes to 7 minutes, and as a result, the 3-strike formula started to become more prominent in order to pad out the runtime. A character is given a job and then makes a mistake. They continue on their way and they make a second mistake, and then they continue again and make the big bad third mistake that ruins everything. They get reprimanded and or realize that they were wrong and somehow fix everything immediately. The mistake did not need to happen 3 times for the story to work, but they needed to fill out 7 minutes somehow. That's the formula for most of the Hit episodes, and as a result, they feel very boring because barely anything happens, and all the dialogue is meant to talk down to babies. And the fact that they were now pressured to produce an entire season every year certainly didn't help. Character derailment became a regular thing here too. Thomas became incredibly irresponsible, Edward would switch between the experienced old man he once was and a pathetic weakling who can hardly do anything, Henry's grumpy side from the previous seasons completely disappeared and he became much softer and worrisome, Percy became childish and naive, Toby also started worrying about pretty much everything, and even Emily, who had just been introduced a season prior to this, got butchered and became an annoying judgmental nag, which isn't helped at all by Michael Brandon's narration.
Thomas, you must go and get your snowplow fitted. He loved talking to children and thought Emily was being a big bossy
The only characters who retained their original personas were Gordon and James, who remained pompous hotshots like they were previously. Season 8 was the first season of this new era, and it was okay, I guess. There were some good episodes in here. I liked Thomas Saves the Day, Gordon Takes Charge is pretty decent, and Squeak, Rattle, and Roll kinda botched the inciting incident, but it has a really good message and a very strong character moment for Gordon. The other episodes, though, I could care less. They're just really formulaic and boring. Also, this season doesn't introduce any new engines, the only season to ever do this, and a lot of existing side characters pretty much disappeared to give focus to the main cast. I can kinda see why they did this. After all, for a soft reboot, you don't want to overwhelm your new audience with a bunch of characters right away, but it's still disappointing that so many faces got the boot. Season 9 was basically Season 8 but worse. This was the season where new characters being introduced for the sole purpose of selling toys started to become a thing. Characters like Molly, Neville, and Dennis were all introduced here, but they basically never appear again after their debut episodes. The Skarloey Railway was reintroduced in this season after being absent in Season 8, and unfortunately the narrow gauge engine suffered from character derailment like many others. For example, Skarloey and Rheneas both became idiotic children, and Duncan went from being a grumpy complainer to actively messing with the other engines. A new narrow gauge engine was introduced as well, Mighty Mac. Mighty Mac is a type of engine called a double-ended fairly, essentially making the two faces conjoined twins. That's a really clever idea for a Thomas character, and in all honesty, their debut episode was actually pretty fun, but they never do anything with this character after this. On the topic of episodes, Thomas's New Trucks was a very fun episode about Thomas and James trying to one-up each other. Emily Knows Best was kinda funny, and probably the only episode in this era where Toby is actually in character. Episodes like Thomas and the New Engine, Thomas's Day Off, and Keeping Up with James were favorites of mine as a kid, but looking back they were pretty nothing episodes that just used the same formula as the others. Skarloey the Brave, Saving Edward, and Toby Feels Left Out are probably the worst of the season, as they're some of the biggest examples of these characters being completely butchered. Respect for Gordon, though, is a fantastic episode on par with the later classic seasons. It uses the longer runtime to its full potential and crafts the best story it can. Best episode of the hit era by far. The rest of the episodes were pretty much just like last season, boring, formulaic garbage. Season 10 was basically more of the same, but somehow even worse. Over on the Skarloey Railway, Sir Handel is finally brought back after 6 seasons of absence, along with introducing a new engine named Fearless Freddy. Too bad their episodes suck. Thomas's Frosty Friend is especially stupid. Wharf and Peace is also a terrible episode that basically solidified the trend of Skarloey being afraid of everything. And Edward Strikes Out is absolutely atrocious. Seriously, how could anybody write or read a script where Edward is extremely rude to a new arrival and think, yeah, this is something the wise, experienced Edward would do? Disgusting. There are very few hidden gems though. It's Good to Be Gordon was pretty good, as was James the Second Best. They were good character episodes for Gordon and James respectively, and I don't think it's a coincidence that the only characters who actually stayed consistent had the best episodes of the era. Not much more than that though. Season 11 is pretty noteworthy for its visuals. The style of set design was given a bit of an overhaul, and everything was now shot in high definition. But how did the episodes line up? Well, Hector the Horrid and Gordon and the Engineer are alright, and Cool Truckings is my personal favorite of the season. Thomas and the Big Bang and Don't Be Silly Billy are both terrible episodes. Thomas and the Big Bang in particular, because the entire episode is just Thomas and the narrow gauge engines intentionally causing thousands of dollars in damages. And in typical hit era fashion, the rest are just boring. Let's move on to the final season of the hit era and the model series as a whole, Season 12. This season didn't just use models. The characters' faces, as well as humans and animals, were animated with CGI provided by Nitrogen Studios. The animation here aged pretty terribly, but similar to Season 7, this thing also has an interesting history of production. Another movie came out right before this season, The Great Discovery, and it's genuinely a very good movie, but the takeaway here is its voice talent. Pierce Brosnan narrated the movie in both the US and UK dubs, and originally the plan was to have him stay on as narrator through at least Season 14. He supposedly recorded the entirety of Season 12, and the episodes were animated to his voice. The show was supposed to go on for a few years in this model CGI hybrid format, but when the decision was made to go 100% CGI with a full voice cast starting the following year, Pierce jumped ship because he would only be voicing the narrator and not the characters themselves. So Hit just brought back the two Michaels so as to not have to pay Pierce as much. So how about the episodes themselves? Well, this season is terrible. I don't think there's a single genuinely good episode in this batch. It's just more of the same formulaic shit, this time with shitty animation to go with it. We do see the return of some old faces here like Duck, Oliver, Donald, and Douglas, but their appearances don't save these episodes at all. In particular, I want to point out Push Me, Pull You, which is widely regarded as the worst episode of the hit era, the worst episode of the model series, and quite possibly the worst episode ever. And I'm inclined to agree. Playing tug of war with a puppet show train? Seriously, who writes this crap? Oh. So yeah, if I haven't already made it clear, the hit era sucked. I'd be lying if I said I don't have childhood nostalgia for any of these episodes, because I absolutely do. I was a 2003 kid, so these were the new episodes when I was growing up, but when it came to picking which DVDs to watch on a given day, I usually found myself preferring the classic episodes. Somehow even Kid Me recognized quality content. There were some good episodes here and there, but overall the hit seasons were big old boring duds. And I'm very sorry to say, things would get worse before they got better. The model series certainly had an interesting run, starting as well-made adaptations of a passionate writer's work and ending as a brainless cash grab baby show. But I hope that through this video I've made the point that it wasn't always just a kid's show. It used to be so much more than that, and some of the CGI seasons would put in genuine effort to recapture that core spirit of the show and its legacy, but that's another story. This has been Wings of Charcoal, and I will see you all in the next video.